the same time as there's heightened awareness about the dramatically negative effects of climate change, we see it in the world around us every day, there's news stories every day. At the same time as we're experiencing that, each of us, in a deeply personal way, we also are seeing from a business and market standpoint that blockchain technology is delivering a lot of the solutions to some of the historic challenges in this market. And so there's this really nice cohesion of a deeply felt challenge and solutions that finally seem viable.
Hello and welcome to the Business of Blockchain. I'm Nisa Amoyles. This special episode focused on a blockchain use case is sponsored by Bitdeer. Today we are talking about climate change and how carbon markets built on blockchain are working. Carbon offsets, also known as voluntary carbon credits, are purchased by corporations to compensate for carbon emissions. One of the companies that facilitates this process using blockchain is Flowcarbon. Today we are joined by Dana Gibber, CEO and co-founder. Welcome, Dana.
Thank you so much for having me. Thrilled to be here.
So tell us, what is the voluntary carbon market and why is it important?
So the voluntary carbon market is a private market that facilitates the transfer of funds from private entities like corporation into projects or companies that remove or reduce carbon emissions from the atmosphere. The way this works is as follows. You have all kinds of innovative technologies that can suck carbon out of the atmosphere. Some of them are the oldest technologies known to man, like trees. You can have a company that plants trees. You also have really innovative new companies that are building machinery to actually suck carbon out of the atmosphere in a very efficient way. These companies have a primary revenue stream that comes in the form of carbon credits. What are carbon credits? You can calculate the amount of carbon that these companies remove from the atmosphere, whether it's through their trees or their various types of machinery that they've built. They can get this process certified by a global carbon credit issuer, and they will then be issued what's known as carbon credits, and those are sold to buyers for revenue. Who are the natural buyers? It's predominantly corporations that buy these as part of their overall ESG and net zero commitments. But in this way, you have companies, private corporations, that are purchasing an asset which is funding carbon removal activity. Now, the key thing to know about this is that it can be potentially transformative in facilitating climate mitigation. Pursuant to the Paris Climate Agreement, which is the standard bearer international agreement that keeps us on a 1.5 degree pathway to avoid the most catastrophic effects of climate change. Under the Paris Agreement, we need about $3 trillion of climate finance annually. We have a major shortfall. We are not coming close to meeting that amount of funding in order to avoid the worst effects of climate change. This is a private market mechanism that can deliver an enormous, up to 30 or 40% of that funding into climate mitigation activities. And so this market is incredibly high potential. There are participants in the form of corporations, innovative technology companies, and all we need is to build the infrastructure to facilitate scale of this market, and we are off to the races in mitigating the worst effects of climate change.
That's fascinating. So why is somebody like Kevin O'Leary from Shark Tank saying that carbon credits are all BS?
That's a great question. So what are carbon credits? A carbon credit is a representation that 1 metric ton of carbon has been removed from the atmosphere or avoided in the first place from being emitted by a project somewhere. Now, a leap of faith is required to believe that that actually happened. Historically, you needed really a vast leap of faith because the recording mechanisms for the activities that were generating the carbon credits were pursuant to PDFs, emails, Word documents. The market infrastructure for recording the activities that led to the generation of carbon credits was nascent. It was not built properly because this has been historically a small market. So when a company purchases a carbon offset, which is a PDF piece of paper in many cases, there's a leap of faith required to believe that that actually represents carbon removal activity that happened at the source, at the project. Now, In the new age of carbon markets, which has been being architected over the last, I would say, 12 to 18 months, and you have innovative companies like Flowcarbon architecting a lot of this infrastructure on blockchain technology, which facilitates the utmost transparency, you can finally trace the activities that are leading to the generation of carbon credits, and so you no longer require this leap of faith. Everything is immutable, it is traced, it is tracked. You can see the activity that has led to the generation of every carbon credit. And so even if historically there was too wide of a believability gap for this market to have the credibility needed to really scale, BS is, I think, hyperbolic, but nonetheless, there was a leap of faith required. The future of this market doesn't require that. The future of this market is built on a technology stack like blockchain, which is immutable. It records all transaction data. You have remote sensing devices and meters happening at the source, at the projects, that record all of the activity that leads to the generation of the carbon credit that is then attached as metadata to the credit itself, especially if the credit comes in the form of a blockchain token, which we will talk about. And so you no longer require any suspension of believability. That's what the future of this market looks like.
Okay, so let's talk about the token. How does that work?
Yes. So a token is a digital asset that could be traded freely. That's what a token is. In our case, the token is essentially like a depository receipt that represents a carbon credit, which is sitting in a traditional carbon registry. But once you tokenize it, you imbue the token with all of the functionality of a carbon credit. So what is the functionality typically attributed to a carbon credit? It can be purchased by a corporation, and then it is retired. Once it is retired, that is how you consume this commodity. And that is when you can claim the environmental benefit of having supported the carbon removal activity that led to the carbon credit being generated. So if you have a direct air capture facility that removes a ton of carbon from the atmosphere and has a credit issued against that ton that it removed, the credit can be purchased by a corporation and then retired, and then that's when the corporation can claim that it actually supported that direct air capture facility. That's how the market works. When you tokenize the carbon credit, you do a number of transformative things. The first is you open access to that carbon credit to the entire universe of buyer sets. How does purchasing carbon credits work right now? It's done almost 85% over the counter through a small network of intermediaries who facilitate bilateral transactions between the universe of large corporate buyers and the projects. But what that means is we have no transparency around how much carbon credits cost. And so even though this should function like a commodity where you can build secondary liquid markets around it, it doesn't. You have carbon credits trading at all kinds of different price points that nobody knows. There's no sunlight on this. These are bilateral transactions which require a tremendous amount of individual diligence at the project level. And you have no access for small buyers, for even mid-sized buyers, because the transaction costs are so high. So you have corporations, the large ones that can put a lot of money towards working with intermediaries to buy in large batches. What happens when you tokenize the carbon credits is that each one becomes a unit that can be bought and sold by anyone. And so you have democratized access to this market, which expands the universe of buyers, which is great because, as I mentioned earlier, this is a market that can deliver up to 30% or more of the $3 trillion annually that we need to prevent catastrophic climate change. So all of a sudden, you expand the universe to anybody who has a blockchain wallet. They can go on an exchange and they can buy 1 carbon credit or 5 carbon credits instead of the large volumes. They can do it on their phone instead of needing to contact some broker or intermediary. And they can do it at a transparent price. You, me, and large corporates are all paying the same price because we're accessing the same asset on the same platform. So you've introduced price transparency, you've introduced democratized access, and you've introduced liquidity. You've expanded the demand side of the market. then the buyer can retire it and claim the environmental benefit. So all of a sudden, you can be supporting these projects, I can be supporting these projects. Everybody can be transformed into a buyer of carbon
So everybody, retail, corporations can get involved in climate change now.
Exactly. Small businesses, mid-sized corporates, and this is really exciting. What is a token? It is a line of code. So even though it represents, it's irrevocably tied back to an actual carbon credit that's sitting in a registry, it's a line of code, and so it can be embedded into all kinds of developer applications. And so we have an ecosystem of developer partners, meaning engineering partners, who are coding carbon credits into loyalty rewards programs, into point of sale offsetting, so that every good that's purchased can be tied back to a portion of a carbon credit that's retired. You have all kinds of applications that are embedding carbon credits and offsetting into their applications in a way that's seamless and thus scalable. That's what you need for scale.
So this is super exciting. Do you
I think so.
anticipate that in the next year, more and more people will learn about this and adopt it? Like, what are your goals for the next year?
100%. So the carbon markets as a concept are taking off in a very big way. Awareness about and exposure to carbon markets has been rapidly increasing. There's been a lot of attention paid to these markets precisely because of their promise and also because of the challenges that historically have seemed intractable, but now companies like ours are coming up with solutions to finally address these challenges, to provide access, transparency, liquidity, ease of transacting. And so the promise of these markets is finally within sight. And so at the same time as there's heightened awareness about the dramatically negative effects of climate change, we see it in the world around us every day, there's news stories every day. At the same time as we're experiencing that, each of us in a deeply personal way, we also are seeing from a business and market standpoint that blockchain technology is delivering a lot of the solutions to some of the historic challenges in this market. And so there's this really nice cohesion of a deeply felt challenge and solutions that finally seem viable.
So we have this photo of you and your co-founder. Why don't you tell us a little bit why you started Flowcarbon and how this happened?
Absolutely. So my co-founder is my sister, Caroline. We're two of the co-founders of Flowcarbon. I'm the CEO, she's our COO. We were involved in an environmental project in South America a couple of years ago. It was a very large-scale project run by a number of local and environmental NGOs. And to make a sort of long soap opera story condensed, what happened was there was a funding gap, meaning the philanthropy dollars that had been collected to buy and preserve this massive ecosystem that was essential not only because it was some of the oldest growth rainforests in the world, but because it was a habitat for a number of endangered species. The funding that had been collected ultimately was insufficient because a private landowner jacked up the price at the last minute. And so there was a funding shortfall, and somebody on the NGO side surfaced carbon markets and carbon credits as a potential solution for plugging this gap. And my sister and I, our ears perked up. We were on the funding side, we were involved on the philanthropy side. Our ears perked up and we said, wait, a market? A market mechanism? What are you talking about? We thought that all you could do was conserve old growth rainforest or support climate mitigation activity through philanthropy, which is why it's not scaling. And it turned out there was a market. There is a market called the voluntary carbon market, which can provide up to, as I said, 40% of the funding needed, the $3 trillion needed. And when we did a deep dive into this market, we realized that all that was standing between this market and real scale was infrastructure challenges. And the more we looked at it, we said, not only are these infrastructure challenges solvable, but they are solvable by this emerging technology known as blockchain. It was this real eureka moment where we realized that this emerging market known as the voluntary carbon market and this emerging technology known as blockchain were almost tailor-made for one another, because the precise challenges that had historically besetted the carbon markets were exactly what blockchain can solve. Transparency, an immutable ledger that documents data and activities, liquidity, access, These are exactly the challenges that blockchain solves, which the carbon markets need.
Well, we are certainly looking forward to your progress. This is extremely exciting, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
That's it for today's edition of the Business of Blockchain. This special report highlighting a blockchain use case was sponsored by Bitdeer. I'm Nisa Amoyles at the NASDAQ Market Site.